This is one of our 4 mid-Gangham parish churches. We have Edburton, Poynings, Newtimber and Highcombe. And this one has a particular history to it, which we're going to be hearing a bit more about this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Alan Lester from Sussex University. You've got all the qualifications. I won't try and name them all because I did read the biography, but highly qualified, highly respected, much celebrated, an author and a historian of great note. So it's a great privilege, Alan, to have you here with us today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming and giving up your time on such a lovely day, especially to those of you who've done quite a walk, I gather, to get here. I really appreciate it. What I'm going to say, what I'm going to try and do is put the story of this particular church in the broader context of the British Empire and changes in the nature of the British Empire over a roughly sort of 300-year period. And I've got to start with a confession that all of the material that I'm going to present you in terms of the church itself hasn't been researched by me. It's been researched by local volunteers, including Sheila, Neri and others, Margaret, who have been working on this stuff for years. What I've tried to do is take material that they've generated and set it in this broader context. So I'll talk about 3 episodes in the history of the church's relationship with empire. Each one deals with a different aspect of the British Empire, which is a highly complex and contradictory entity at any given time. I'll talk about 3 families, each episode connected with a family who owned Newtimber Place and had what was called the advowson, which was the right to appoint the rector to this church. Not all, but some of those families also commemorated in memorials around the church. And I'll talk about each family's relationship with the British Empire at that time, when they were engaged with the manor house and with the church. First, the Newnham family, who were associated with the activities in both halves of the British Empire of the late 18th century. The eastern half as shareholders and a director of the East India Company. The western half as investors in the South Sea Company, which, among other things, traded in enslaved African captives. Then I'll come on to the Gordon family, father and son, who were also involved on the Caribbean, the Western Hemispheric side of the British Empire, as slave owners of plantations in Jamaica, and who were responsible for building the tower. And then I'll come on to the Buxton family, who are known for their work at the other end of the slavery spectrum in helping to abolish slavery in the early 19th century, and for the governor-generalship of South Africa in the early 20th century. So those are the 3 kind of episodes in which I'll focus out from the church to the empire. Starting with Newnham then, Nathaniel Newman was a London merchant who bought Newtimber Place in 1741, and along with that came the advowson, the right to appoint the rector. He was a director of the East India Company from 1738 to 1758, on and off. The directorship rotated during these years, and also a director of the South Sea Company in 1761. The East India Company had been founded in 1600 as a trading venture. It was undergoing something of a transition at the time that Newnham was one of its directors. This was the decade leading up to the Battle of Plassey. In the Battle of Plassey, Robert Clive, known as Clive of India, defeated a Bengali army and turned the company from a trading concern into a governing and rent extraction concern. So in other words, the East India Company's business model began to change. Shareholders back in Britain started to get a greater proportion of their dividends, not from trading in commodities, but from charging Indians rent for the privilege of being governed by those shareholders and their directors in London. 1757 marked that moment of transition. Newnham was a director during the Battle of Plassey and in the run-up to it, but what's often less appreciated than Clive's role as victor in Plassey is that the company was already beginning this transition from a trading concern to a locally governing and rent extracting concern. It did so by making the most, opportunistically, of the collapse of the Mughal Empire in India. So a few years before Newton became a director, Nader Shah, a ruler from Persia, had invaded and sacked Delhi, taken the Kohinoor diamond, the Peacock throne, and billions, in today's terms, worth of treasure from Delhi back to Persia. The Mughal Empire was constantly being raided as it lost its authority by Maratha marauding bands. And within this context of a decline of the established Mughal authority, the East India Company started to invest more, recruiting and training Indian soldiers under its command, known as sepoys, to gain control of its trading forts, particularly Madras and later Calcutta, and to offer safe haven effectively to Indian merchants, Indian bankers, the wealthy elites of the former Mughal Empire, essentially. And the company had already started to transition into a municipal government of a kind, governing these entities, the forts and the towns around them, offering relative security during a period of anarchy, as William Dalrymple calls it, through the collapse of the Mughal Empire, and seeing opportunities to generate more income for its shareholders back in Britain. So it was already starting to charge rent to Indians, a form of taxation in India, some of which was spent in India, mostly on expanding its armies so that the expansion could continue thereafter during the collapse of the Mughal Empire, and it would take on ever more territory under company control, but also sending a proportion of that rent back to Britain to supplement the income from trading. As not only an investor, but a director, we don't know how much of Newton's wealth came from the East India Company. It's really difficult to disaggregate sources of income once it all ends up in a bank account. Even today, this kind of forensic accountancy is very difficult. So I'm not willing to say this proportion or that proportion of wealth came from the East India Company, but certainly some of the wealth of the family was extracted from India in this way. At the same time, like many of the British elite, the landowning and mercantile trading elite of the time, the Newtons were investing in a whole range of other activities, again, which makes this fungibility of assets quite difficult to track down. One of those investments was in the South Sea Company. Now, some of you, particularly if you read the Church Times or have been following debates about the Church's reparative scheme known as Project Spire, may have come across the South Sea Company and some of the controversy over it. The Church of England had an investment fund known as Queen Anne's Bounty during the late 17th and early 18th century, which was used mainly to support clergymen and their families when they didn't have a parish that they were attached to. It's a kind of welfare fund, social security fund for clergy. Queen Anne's Bounty invested quite heavily in the South Sea Company. The South Sea Company was a strange entity. It was set up primarily to help the British government deal with the enormous debt that it had incurred during the wars against Spain and France at the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century. So basically, the company bought debt from all of those different entities who had loaned to the government and then managed that debt and secured an income through government interest payments on the debt. That was always its main source of income. Those who don't want the church to engage in any kind of reparative measure emphasise this income that came from government debt, and they try to minimise the extent of income that came from slave trading. But slave trading was the other concern of the South Sea Company. In order to attract people willing to sell their government debt to the South Sea Company, it had to offer very lucrative rewards in the future, and it did so by negotiating what was called the asiento. At the end of the War of Spanish Succession, with Britain victorious, part of the treaty negotiations at the Treaty of Utrecht involved Spain giving the South Sea Company the asiento. The Asiento was the contract to supply enslaved Africans to all of the Spanish colonies in Latin America, in Central and South America. So rather than Spanish ships sailing to the west coast of Africa, taking captives to South America, the Asiento meant that the British South Sea Company could now conduct that trade. So lots of investors came to the South Sea Company attracted by that promise of rewards beyond their wildest dreams from supplying all the captives that the Spanish colonies needed in South America. Now, ultimately, and again, the critics of the church's reparative scheme emphasised this, they didn't get the rewards they were hoping for. The slave trade wasn't as profitable as they had hoped. That was mainly because England kept launching new wars, or vice versa with Spain, so that trade kept getting interrupted during the first half of the 18th century. But nevertheless, while the Church of England and its Queen Anne's bounty held funds, and while the Newtons here held funds in the South Sea Company, it still bought 20,000 people from the West African coast, put them in chains in the holds of slave ships and transported them to the Americas. Of those 20,000, 3,000 died on the Middle Passage, as it was called. So horrendous were the conditions below decks where these captives were chained. So the surviving 17,000 were sold in South American colonies and to some British colonies in the Caribbean. And during the 1720s, when Queen Anne's bounty was still invested in the South Sea Company, the trade was profitable. So over the whole existence of the South Sea Company, the slave trade made a loss, but during the 1720s, it did make a profit. And it's on that basis that the church is engaging in Project Spire. Newnham used some of his income. As I say, I'm not going to venture to say exactly which bits of income from where it was, but he used some of his income to build the vault and the north chapel of this church in 1756. Okay, I'm going to skip to the second episode now, and a second family who bought Newtimber Place, and along with it, the Adbowson, the right to appoint the rector to this church, and who are memorialised in the church. And this is the Gordon family, father and son. Charles Gordon bought Newtimber Place in 1825, but he was lent the money to buy it by his father, Charles Gordon of Braco, who was a slave and plantation owner and had been since 1798. So Charles Gordon Sr. of Braco owned the Braco estate in Trelawney in Jamaica, where, like many others of his generation, he made a fortune in sugar production and sale, using, of course, enslaved labour imported from Africa. This particular part of Jamaica along the north coast was one of the last to be cleared of bush by enslaved labour and developed for sugar production. So it was the last real sugar production boom in Jamaican history in the late 18th century. And Gordon was at the forefront of that late boom and profited by it. Just to zoom out to this context of slavery then, which I've already mentioned in relation to the South Sea Company, and to put it in perspective of modern history and global history as a whole, I think that's quite important to do. In all, in the transatlantic slave trade from the late 16th to the mid-19th century, some 12.7 million African captives were trafficked from West Africa across the Atlantic. The ships which carried most were Portuguese, to Portuguese colonies in South America. The second highest number of slave ships were British. British ships carried 3.1 million of these 12.7 million captives in total. British slave trade was the dominant one during the 18th century. This was the moment of concentrated British power and wealth generated through the slave trade. In all, around 40% of the captives carried to the Americas between 1740 and 1806 were carried by British ships' captains and ship owners. The plantation-based economy in the North American colonies before the Revolutionary War and in the Caribbean became a key driver of global and especially British economic transformation during this period. Historians debate the exact extent to which slavery, not just the slave trade, but the whole plantation complex enabled by slavery, sugar, cotton, coffee, tobacco, the extent to which that whole industry and sector fueled the Industrial Revolution, that's still an ongoing debate. But there's absolutely no doubt that it played a vital role. It was one of the catalysts, along with others. This is again heavily politicised at the moment, with many people on the right trying to contest, particularly after Black Lives Matter, trying to contest the idea that slavery was important for Britain's economic growth. The way that I would see it is the British Industrial Revolution, which enabled Britain and then the rest of Europe to leap ahead of other parts of the world in terms of economic growth. That revolution, if we think of it as something like a cake, a specially baked cake, it's a unique cake. It was the first in the world of its kind in the late 18th and early 19th century. And it came together, the Industrial Revolution, as a result of particular ingredients in particular measures being combined at that time. Most of those ingredients have long been known about and written about in British history because they're the British Isles-centred ingredients, coal reserves, the government security for investors that came after the Glorious Revolution in 1688, the financial security that was offered by the City of London with its insurance market and so on, the technological capacity to develop weaving machines, the machines used in textile factories, canal building, all of these kinds of things, they were ingredients, vital ingredients. But what's been left out of the story until the last 10, 15 years of academic research, really, actually well before that, there was a black historian, Eric Williams, in the 1940s, who published a book saying that we need to think about slavery and the income, the capital derived from slavery too. But there was a lot of resistance to Williams' ideas in the 40s. More recently, historians have started to appreciate that to a great extent, not fully, but to a great extent, Williams was right. This plantation complex was generating capital that fed into this industrial transformation. And it's no coincidence that the Industrial Revolution happened on the Atlantic-facing side of Britain, in and around the ports and their hinterland towns that were engaged in that Atlantic plantation complex: Liverpool, Manchester, Lancashire, Yorkshire. These were all regions where capital derived from not just the slave trade, that was a minor part of it, actually trading in captives, but the exchange of products cultivated by enslaved labour, that this played a major, some would argue a catalytic role, and combined with the other ingredients, helped to set off the Industrial Revolution. So there's debates about just how important slavery was, but there's no doubt it was one of those ingredients that made a unique combination propelling the British Industrial Revolution, the first in the world. The fact that it had to be combined with other ingredients is why, for example, Portugal, I mentioned earlier, it took captive more people, engaged in the slave trade for longer, but didn't go through that Industrial Revolution because it wasn't slavery alone that drove it. It had to be combined with those other British-specific elements, financial institutions, coal, etc. In the 1770s then, Jamaica alone, where the Gordon family were investing much of their money, was producing about 10% of the private wealth of England and Wales. The plantations in the American and Caribbean colonies as a whole were 3 times as economically valuable as Scotland, twice as economically valuable as Ireland, and roughly equivalent to rapidly industrialising Lancashire and Yorkshire combined in terms of their contribution to GDP. The African historian Josephine Okori estimated that in 1770, the slave trade and the broader plantation economy combined were furnishing as much as 55% of Britain's gross fixed capital formation. That's a measure of how much of the new value added each year in economy is reinvested in further productive capacity rather than just consumed and spent on luxury items and so on. So much of this investment was channeled to the factories and to the infrastructure driving the Industrial Revolution. The most recent synthesis of all this research on the role of slavery by Maxine Berg and Pat Hudson concludes that, quote, the slave and plantation trades were the hub around which many other dynamic and innovatory sectors of the economy pivoted. The key manufacturing regions relied on access to Atlantic port cities, principally Liverpool, London, Glasgow and Bristol, and to the capital and credit that they generated. Now we start to come to the end of slavery, abolitionism, and preparing the way for the next family, the Buxton family. The Gordons profited from the ownership of a fluctuating number of enslaved workers whose names Sheila has tracked down so that we can attempt to reverse the dehumanisation to which they were subject during their lifetimes and tell as much of their story as possible. When slavery was finally abolished, actually only to be replaced by a further 4 years of coerced labour, known as apprenticeship, in 1834, it was not the enslaved who were compensated for having endured their loss of freedom. It was the slave owners who received compensation from the British government for the loss of their property, their human property. In all, the government raised a loan on the money markets for £20 million, roughly £2.5 billion worth today, to pay off the slave owners upon emancipation in 1834. What happened to that loan subsequently is very complex. It goes through various hands, but it was finally paid off only in 2015. Some 46,000 British slave owners were paid for the loss of 800,000 enslaved people at that moment in time in 1834. Charles Gordon of Newtimber Place received £8,000 then, roughly equivalent to £900,000 now, for a share in 403 enslaved people that he owned on the Breco estate and other estates in Jamaica. And we can be quite specific about this, thanks to research by Mira from University of Sussex here and the others, volunteers I mentioned earlier, that in his will, he left £200 specifically of that compensation money, in this case we can be sure, to be spent in the building of the church tower here at Newtimber, spent by his son. Gordon was not alone among the Sussex absentee slave owners. So these were people who owned plantations and people in the Caribbean, but who rarely, if ever, visited. They lived here and owned them at a distance. In all, there were 191 absentee slave owners living in Sussex and awarded compensation in 1834. They include, many of them were clergymen. They included the Reverend Robert Allen of Barkham Church, who got £125,000 in today's terms for owning 123 people. Cecilia Blake of Brighton, who got £500,000 in today's terms for 188 people that she owned. And Henry Gage, whose brother owned Firle Place, which some of you may know, who received £180,000 in today's money for the ownership of 150 people. So we have emancipation in 1834. All of this, by the way, I'm very happy to take questions if there's time at the end to go into more detail. I now want to move on to how abolition came about, which brings us to our third Newtimber Place owning family, the Buxtons. Thomas Fowle Buxton's grandson, Sidney Buxton, is commemorated around this church. And I'll come on to what he did as Governor General of South Africa in a moment. But to stick with Thomas Fowle now. Thomas Fowle Buxton was one of the leading anti-slavery campaigners, and he was the leading anti-slavery campaigner in the House of Commons. He was the man whose persistent efforts to bring an emancipation bill before the House finally paid off in 1833. Just to deal with a bit of prehistory, though, 1833 was when those captives still held in captivity in the Caribbean and in the Cape Colony and in Mauritius were finally freed. But prior to that, the slave trade had been abolished. So British and then other nations were barred from taking new captives from Africa across the Atlantic in 1807. And it had taken an almighty campaign to bring about that abolition of the slave trade and set the scene for the abolition of slavery itself some 30 years later. Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce, the best known leader in Parliament, all well-recognised names. But there were also escaped and freed former captives, formerly enslaved Africans involved in that campaign. Two of the best known are Uludor Equiano, whose narrative of his life being taken captive in West Africa, transported, finally gaining his manumission, his freedom, was a PR coup for the anti-slavery campaigners in Britain because it brought that first-hand testimony to a British public. And Ottobah Cugoano was another highly active, freed African man living in London, campaigning for the abolition of the slave trade. Cugoano should be given a lot more credit for something that Britain often takes credit for. Once Britain had abolished its own slave trade, it then negotiated with other countries that they should abolish theirs too, and policed that abolition of the slave trade with ships known as the West Africa Squadron after 1807. That was Cugoano's idea initially. He argued that Britain had a responsibility not only to abolish its own slave trade, but that given the wealth that Britain had generated through its dominance of that trade in the 18th century, it should also make itself responsible for policing abolition more broadly. But he's very rarely credited with that idea. By the time we get to the 1830s, Thomas Fowle Buxton takes over from the retiring William Wilberforce as the leader of anti-slavery in the House of Commons. By the 1830s, the West Africa Squadron is trying to police this slave trade, largely ineffectually, it has to be said, although it intercepted around 160 slave ships, and you can't use the word freed, partially freed, around 160,000 African captives. The sailors did their job extremely well, intercepting these ships and taking their captives to courts of commission that were established around the Atlantic. At those courts of commission, those liberated Africans, as they were called, were not returned home. None of them made it back to their country of origin. All of them were put into a system known by the British government as the disposal system. And they were allocated as unpaid apprentices, not slaves, apprentices, for 14 years at least, to British settlers wherever they were required around the empire. Many of them went straight to the Caribbean, straight on the sugar plantations to replace enslaved people who just had their emancipation after 1834. A lot of them had their contracts of indenture, apprenticeship, renewed with or without their consent for life. So when we talk about liberated Africans, historians increasingly, now that they're aware of these stories, call them recaptives. Not the West Africa Squadron's fault. They did the best they could, but the imperial labour system's fault. To come back to Thomas Fowle Buxton then, I've been working on the British Empire for around sort of 30 years now. Buxton's one of the people I just keep getting drawn back to. I've written mini biographies of him because he was just so extensively engaged in virtually every corner of the British Empire as a humanitarian, a liberal reformer. That had its limits, which I'll come on to a bit later, but certainly in terms of getting the worst abuses of the British Empire ended, Buxton was about as active as anyone could have been. He not only saw through the bill abolishing slavery in the mid-1830s, he also set up a committee to investigate what was happening in the settler colonies at this time. So just as slavery was ending in the Caribbean, large-scale British emigration, colonial settlement, was starting in Australia, a bit later in New Zealand, and in Canada. As one group of people were securing their liberation from enslavement, other groups, Aboriginal people in Australia, Māori, First Nations in Canada, were facing an invasive wave of settlers taking their land and killing them when they resisted. Buxton was active against that too. As soon as he'd seen through the anti-slavery bill in Parliament, he established a committee to protect the rights of Aboriginal people, known as the Aborigines Committee. He was active in the RSPCA, he was active in prison reform, one of those great kind of tireless, ceaseless humanitarian campaigners. His son, Charles, took up the campaign where his father had left off. He became chairman of the Aborigines Protection Society, trying to defend the rights of these indigenous peoples around the empire against British settlement, failing overall, but securing some successes for certain groups along the way. And Thomas Fowle's grandson, Sydney, Earl Buxton, inherited Newtimber Place and became Governor General of South Africa between 1914 and 1920. Just see how I'm getting on for time. About 5 more minutes, I think. Now, this was an interesting time to be a British Governor General of South Africa. Earl Buxton certainly tried to continue in his father's and his grandfather's liberal reformist tradition, but he faced difficult odds in South Africa in the Edwardian period. He really inherited a country that was being reconstructed, a union of South Africa that had been created in 1910, just 4 years before his arrival, and built on the ashes of the Boer War, the South African War, fought between 1899 and 1902. I haven't got time to go into the context for that. I'm happy to come back to it later. But essentially, it was a struggle for control of a number of colonies and Afrikaner Boer settlements, republics, and remaining African independent polities in the region that resulted in a very hard-fought British victory in 1902, in which 2 Boer republics were defeated. Britain now oversaw the dominion, as it was called, of a unified South Africa in 1910, but still had a lot of resentment to deal with, not only from the Boers, who had been defeated in war at great cost to the British, but also from many of the African societies who had been promised the vote if they owned enough property across the whole of South Africa if Britain won this war. In the event, during the negotiations to end the war with the Boers at the Treaty of Vereeniging, the British betrayed that promise. They secured the Boer surrender by saying, we'll retain a property-based, non-racial franchise, still excluded the vast majority of Africans because they didn't meet the property threshold, but nevertheless, if you were a wealthy enough African, you could vote. That was retained in the 2 British colonies, former British colonies in South Africa, the Cape and Natal. But elsewhere, over the 2 Boer republics and African policies that were now being absorbed into the Union of South Africa, Africans couldn't vote. It was a racist, directly racist franchise. Buxton, in principle, was opposed to that. As a liberal humanitarian imperialist, he would have wanted to maintain that property franchise. But he had to oversee a reconstruction regime and secure reconciliation with the Boers. That became all the harder for him as soon as he arrived and the First World War broke out, because the South African Parliament was split. Many of its Boer representatives wanting to not only be neutral, but actually side with Germany against the British, having just fought against them. Others willing to embrace the oversight of the British Empire and carve out a fairly independent South Africa, largely under Boer majority control. Buxton worked closely with Louis Botha, who was the new Afrikaner Prime Minister, and who had actually been one of the most effective generals in the Boer War against the British. So the 2 enemies reconciled to try and unify South Africa within the British Empire and stay loyal to the empire. And in the event, a rebellion by Boers who armed themselves and tried to fight against the South African and British forces on behalf of Germany was put down. And the South African army under British officership invaded German South West Africa, now Namibia, in one of the first campaigns, victorious campaigns against Germany in the war. To conclude, the counterside of this reconstruction. Much as Buxton would have liked a different outcome, that reconciliation between Boer and Britain in early 20th century South Africa came very much at the expense of black South Africans. Most English-speaking settlers, whom Buxton did most to try and represent, and Afrikaners did agree on one thing. Regardless of whether elite Africans could get the vote or not, the maintenance of white control, of white supremacy in South Africa was paramount. And this was one of the reasons why the SS Mendi disaster occurred. There's a memorial here to the SS Mendi. In the context of reconciliation in South Africa, Africans were put into overcrowded, denuded, environmentally degraded reserves, given little option to farm their own land, really presented with the only option of working in white-owned mines or white-owned factories or white-owned industries, with past laws regulating their movement from the reserves. The reserves were about 11%, 13% of South Africa's land area to house about 75% of its population, Africans. So during the First World War, when British recruiters went into one of the reserves in the Eastern Cape, where Xhosa-speaking people lived, and said, there's an opportunity to come and fight or work with the British on the Western Front in the First World War, many of the local African men saw it as a chance to escape mine work and to escape the degradation of the reserves and to yield some service for the empire, many of them again hoping, as they had during the Boer War, that the British would give something back afterwards, that their conditions would improve. They were recruited into the South African Native Labour Corps. The white South African-dominated parliament made it absolutely clear that it would not allow recruitment of armed Africans in case they got used to shooting white men on the Western Front. So they were barred from fighting, but they were used as a labour corps to dig trenches, to act in medical work on the front line. They were exposed to as much danger as anyone else, but not armed. And the SS Mendi was a troop ship carrying some of them across the Channel when it was hit by another freight ship and sunk in the English Channel with the loss of over 600 Native Labour Corps lives. That story is being told more by the volunteers working for this church than by anybody else who have been getting in touch with some of the descendants of those who died in South Africa. But that's a story for others to tell.